If you have ever peeled an onion, then you know that the first thin paper layer reveals another thin paper layer, and that layer reveals another, and before you know it, you have hundreds of layers all over the kitchen table and thousands of tears in your eyes. Sorry that you ever started peeling in the first place, and wishing that you had left the onion alone to wither away on the shelf of the pantry while you went on with your life, even if that meant never again enjoying the complicated and overwhelming taste of this strange and bitter vegetable. In this way, the story of the Nasrid Sultanate is like an onion. The end of this unhappy chronicle is like its bad beginning, as each misfortune only reveals another, and only those with the stomach for this strange and bitter tale should venture any further into the Nasrid onion. I'm sorry to tell you this, but that is how the story goes. Muhammad V had succeeded his father in 1354 at the young age of 16. He understood the very little power he held, and so he tried to make good relations with the Castilians. He paid tribute to them and gave military support. This was controversial in his own realm. However, the Castilians really enjoyed it apparently. A good example of this is that when King Pedro built his palace in Seville, it was almost an identical copy of the Muslim palace, probably a high point of cultural exchange. However, like I said, his subservience to the Castilians was controversial and he was overthrown. He barely managed to escape with his head and went to Guadix, where a small group of Berbers, loyal to his father, protected him. This was in 1359, and his half-brother Ismail II was put in power. He, however, was killed shortly after by an ambitious co-conspirator. The co-conspirator took power for himself and became Muhammad VI. 6 rulers named Muhammad, and it's only been like a century since the dynasty was founded. Muhammad V, however, hadn't given up. With the help of his Berber protectors and the Castilians, he was able to march on Granada with a large army. Muhammad VI ran away and threw himself at the mercy of Pedro the Cruel. As you'd expect, he was executed because Pedro saw more advantage in an alliance with Muhammad V. This was around 1362. The next few years were fairly peaceful. Castilians were busy with a civil war, and the Marinids were in no position to land on Iberia. Muhammad V took advantage of this to consolidate his borders and fortify some fortresses. In 1391, when he died, the kingdom had enjoyed 20 good years of prosperity and peace. However, that was about to change. He was succeeded by his son, Yusuf II, who died a year later in 1392, apparently of natural causes. His younger son, Muhammad VII, was put in power by the elites of the kingdom. Over the next few years, Castile was busy with the minority of its own king, Enrique III. However, some rogue elements did raid Granada, but were almost always fought back. Muhammad VII was, although, also looking for an opportunity to attack the Castilians. In 1405, Muhammad led his army to the frontiers of Murcia. Enrique was unable to fight back because he was not expecting the attack. The Granadans and the Castilians were in a truce. Muhammad had just violated it. However, Enrique died the next year, and so Muhammad found a little success. Juan II, the new king of Castile, was a child, and his uncle Fernando served as the regent. Fernando raised an army and fought back. Granada was being ravaged when they asked for peace in 1408. Muhammad VII died the same year and was replaced by his brother Yusuf III. That timeline at the top just isn't big enough to contain all these changes in rulership. In 1410, Fernando, the regent of Castile, broke the truce and attacked a small town called Antequera. The main castle was well defended, and despite some efforts to relieve the town, the city was forced to surrender. This victory, while small, was praised a lot in the Castilian circuits and contributed directly to Fernando being chosen as the new king of Aragon. In 1410, the Nasrid Sultanate found some external peace. However, internal disputes were getting more and more out of control. Yusuf III died in 1417, leaving his young son Muhammad VIII as his successor. 2 years later, in 1419, Muhammad VIII was deposed by another member of the dynasty. The new sultan was Muhammad IX. Muhammad VIII was put in a prison. In 1427, a popular revolution in Granada, which was riled up by a very expensive recent treaty with the Castilians, saw the sultan flee to Tunisia. However, he came back with the help of the Hafsids and took his throne back. This time, however, he executed Muhammad VIII. The leader of the popular revolution, Ridwan, helped the Castilians attack Granada. A small victory by the Christians was achieved in the Battle of Higueruela when the Christians were able to push the Muslims back to the walls of Granada. During the revolution, Ridwan had propped up a pretender to the throne, Yusuf ibn al-Mawl, who wasn't even a Nasirid, but his mother was. After the Christian attack, he was briefly put in power by the Castilians, but was overthrown by Muhammad IX and executed. Muhammad IX started his third reign, which would be his longest, in 1432. For the next 13 years, there was quite a bit of peace as the Christians were busy amongst themselves. However, in 1445, Muhammad IX was overthrown by Muhammad X, who also had the unfortunate nickname of the Lame. He had previously served as the governor of Almeria. However, the elites did not support him, and Muhammad IX was back in 1447. Muhammad IX died in 1453 or 1454. However, before he died, Muhammad IX, in an attempt to put the house of Nasr back in order, declared the son of Muhammad VIII to be his heir, the same man he had killed himself. The new sultan was named Muhammad XI. The elites, especially a dynasty called Banu Sarraj, who had been playing the sultans for a long time, were against Muhammad and installed a new candidate as their sultan. A man named Saad was chosen as the pretender. A civil war broke out. Matters were made worse when Enrique IV became the king of Castile. He had some internal problems, and as all good politicians do, he decided to use religious war to distract his people. Enrique attacked Granada, but they didn't even engage the sultan. Instead, they ravaged the countryside and left. This devastation weakened Muhammad XI so much that Saad laid siege to Granada. Muhammad fled, he was ambushed and killed when he tried to claim his throne back. Saad, now the sole ruler, decided to get rid of the intrigue by the elites, the same elites who had put him in power. He invited the Banu Sarraj at a banquet and had them all killed. However, not all members of the family were there, and some of them fell back to Malaga and established a base of power there. In the midst of this conflict, Gibraltar finally fell to the Christians in 1461. 3 years later, Saad himself was deposed by his son Abul Hassan. A new, more aggressive era of warfare was started, as Hugh Kennedy writes. Frontier warfare and skirmishing with rival Christian powers continued. A series of events in 1471 illustrate how complex relations were. In May, Miguel Lucas, constable of Jaén, and Alonso de Aguilar attempted to take Montejicar by surprise, but the Granadans were warned by the Count of Cabra, who sent his son with 500 knights and 2,000 foot to help the Muslims, and the attempt failed. In response, 3,000 Muslim horsemen assembled and pillaged the area around Porcuna, taking 400 captives. At the same time, the Marquis of Cadiz seized Cardela in the west, and his rival appealed for help to Abul Hassan, who retook the palace from the Marquis. The event of 1471, by no means untypical, shows how rivalries and jealousies on the Christian side often outweighed any consideration of holy war against the Muslims, and how, in these fairly small-scale encounters, the troops of Granada were able to put up a good fight against Christian armies. The ascension of Isabella to the Castilian throne in 1474 made little difference at first. Preoccupied with securing her own position in Castile, she entrusted the Marquis of Cabra with the task of securing truces with Granada. Raids continued. In 1477, the Sultan penetrated deep into Murcian territory, sacked the town of Cieza, which belonged to the Order of Santiago, and returned with 700 prisoners. The continued vitality of the Kingdom of Granada can be seen in the reconquest of the fortress of Zahara. On 27 December 1481, a force of 300 horse and 4,000 foot from the Ronda area, led by one Ibrahim al-Hakim, stormed the castle and took more than 100 prisoners. The taking of Zahara was the last time that the Muslims were able to take and garrison a fortress. In 1479, Fernando of Aragon succeeded his father as King Fernando V, and he and his wife Isabella of Castile decided on a systemic war of conquest against the Kingdom of Granada. This warfare was very different from the raiding and counter-raiding of earlier years. The Andalusian aristocracy were ordered by the Catholic kings Fernando and Isabella, and siege equipment was always taken. As a declaration of this new era, the town of Alhama de Granada was attacked in 1482. This town was considered impregnable and was the most important city on the road to Granada. Attempts were made to save the city, but it fell to the Christians in a surprise storm. However, the Castilians did not have it as easy as they had expected, and they suffered a great loss at another siege the following year, although the Nasrid Sultanate once again proved vulnerable to internal dissension. Abul Hassan was overthrown by his son Muhammad with the help of the Banu Sarraj and other noblemen. Abul Hassan, along with his brother, started a war with his own son, Muhammad XII. Muhammad, eager to prove himself, tried to take a castle from the Castilians, where he was captured and only released when he gave his son and the sons of his supporters to the Christians as hostages. The Christians kept advancing and using artillery to destroy cities. They were fully aware of the internal strife of the Sultanate and were able to make full use of it. After a long and confusing civil war in 1487, Muhammad XII, known to the Christians as Boabdil, was able to take Alhambra from his uncle, who had been his primary rival since his father Abul Hassan retired due to old age. When Boabdil was trying to secure what little power he could, Castile was laying siege to Malaga, and the citizens and the garrison of the city were fighting to defend it. The city finally surrendered in August 1487. Baza, the last stronghold of Boabdil's defeated uncle, fell in 1489. Guadix and Almeria were surrendered soon as well. Granada was now on its own. The city of Granada was unable to survive on its own. It was cut off from the rest of the world, and even without a siege, it was out of supplies. Throughout 1490 and 1491, the city's people put up brave defense, but it was all in vain. On November 25th, 1491, Granada was surrendered. The city was cleared the next month, and on 1st of January 1492, the keys of the city were handed over by Sultan Muhammad XII, also known as Boabdil of Granada, the last Muslim ruler in Iberia. The Reconquista was complete. In the same year, with the patronage of the same king and queen, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue and found a new world. Over the next century or so, Muslims were completely expelled from Iberia. They were told to choose between conversion, exile, or execution. Some revolts broke out, but in the end, Muslims and Jews were completely expelled. Today, the legacy of Muslim Iberia lives on in some Spanish words, some city names, and some tourist attractions. For a lot of Muslims today, it represents a golden era, where Islam thrived in Europe. Unfortunately, it was no golden era. Muslims entered Iberia during the Dark Ages, when Visigothic Iberia was unable to protect itself. The borders were decided back then. Islam never expanded any further than that. Islamic polities never expanded north of Tagus and the Central Mountain Range, at least not for long. Those borders were sustainable, but as soon as Toledo fell, the Muslims never again had borders protected by geography. On top of that, the following regimes, the Almoravids and Almohads, simply couldn't change their borders. They were unable to lay siege and couldn't even try to push the borders to something more sustainable. Slowly, the borders were pushed back. In my opinion, the geography was just too different for the Muslims from the desert to thrive in. Siege, for instance, was required for the great fortresses of Iberia, but the Muslims were always having a difficult time finding supplies, especially foreign dynasties that didn't even stay long enough to learn about the new terrain. In terms of tolerance, we saw that during some periods, but not always. The Umayyads were good to the Jews, and the Jews held many respectable positions during their time. However, Christians never really held any such positions, with a few exceptions. With the rise of the Almoravids, that too changed. The Dhimis were almost completely expelled by the Almohad. Another big reason, I think, was the loss of people. With the fall of Toledo, many new towns found themselves exposed to Christian raids, and people who could leave slowly left. So eventually, things were left to people who were incapable of propping up and sustaining functioning political entities. I'd like to end with an interesting piece of Muslim Spain's legacy that still lives on. The name California comes from a book called The Adventures of Esplandian, which was published in 1510. In it, California is an island that's ruled by a woman named Queen Calafia, which is the female form of Caliph, the Spanish word for caliph. So California can loosely be translated to the land of the caliph, or female caliph. See you next time.